If this video irritates you within the first few minutes, that reaction matters more than you think. Because weak versions of you do not disappear quietly. They defend themselves. They negotiate. They delay. They scroll. They promise change tomorrow while secretly protecting the habits that keep them small. To the new viewers beginning to notice that discipline is not punishment but separation from illusion, welcome. And to the returning subscribers already building a sovereign mindset through awareness, emotional restraint, and self-control, you already know this channel is not here to comfort you. It is here to expose what most people spend their lives avoiding. Turn on the subtitles. Some truths are easier to understand when you read them slowly. Now listen carefully. Your weak self is not lazy in the way you think. Lazy people do not feel this exhausted. Your weak self is exhausted because it is maintaining too many lies at once. The lie that you still have time. The lie that motivation will return. The lie that one more distraction does not matter. The lie that your current habits are temporary. But temporary behaviors repeated for years become identity. And identity becomes fate. Most people never notice the exact moment they surrendered control over themselves. It did not happen dramatically. There was no collapse, no cinematic failure, no warning siren screaming through the room. It happened quietly. A delayed alarm. A promise broken in private. A task avoided because it felt uncomfortable. A decision to escape instead of confront. Another night staring at a glowing screen while their future slowly starved in the background. That is how self-respect dies now. Not through catastrophe. Through tiny permissions. And the terrifying part is this. You already know which permissions are destroying your life. You feel them every day. You feel them when you wake up already mentally tired before the day even begins. You feel them when you cannot sit still without reaching for stimulation. You feel them when silence becomes uncomfortable. You feel them when your attention fractures after 10 seconds. You feel them when you watch disciplined people and secretly alternate between admiration and resentment. Because discipline exposes people, especially undisciplined people, a man with control over himself becomes a mirror others instinctively avoid. His existence quietly reminds them of everything they abandoned. That is why weak people mock discipline publicly while envying it privately. And if you are honest, you have done this too. Not always out loud, but internally. You saw someone transform themselves physically, mentally, financially, and instead of confronting your own inconsistency, part of you searched for flaws in them so you could remain comfortable where you are. Human beings do this constantly. Not because they are evil. Because the ego protects identity before it protects truth. That is why change feels violent. You are not just replacing habits. You are killing versions of yourself that fought desperately to survive. And weak identities are survivors. People think their worst enemy is failure. It is not. Your worst enemy is familiarity. Familiar pain. Familiar excuses. Familiar routines. Familiar suffering. The brain will often choose predictable misery over uncertain transformation. That is why some people stay trapped in the same cycles for decades while fully aware of what is happening to them. Awareness alone changes nothing. A smoker knows smoking destroys him. A distracted mind knows distraction is damaging. A procrastinator knows delay creates anxiety. Knowledge is cheap now. Transformation is rare. Because transformation requires something modern people are quietly losing the ability to tolerate. Sustained discomfort without immediate reward. Look around carefully. Most people cannot even eat a meal without stimulation anymore. They cannot walk without headphones. Cannot train without recording themselves. Cannot think without opening another tab. Cannot rest without dopamine. Cannot focus without interruption. Their minds are permanently leaking energy. And then they wonder why they feel weak. Weakness is not always physical. Sometimes weakness is needing constant escape from yourself. That is the epidemic nobody wants to discuss honestly. Not lack of intelligence. Not lack of opportunity. Lack of internal control. A person without control over attention eventually loses control over direction. And a person without direction becomes vulnerable to everything. Algorithms, impulses, social pressure, comfort, addiction, fear, approval. You can see it in people's eyes now. Restlessness. Even during moments meant to be peaceful. Especially during silence. Silence forces confrontation. And confrontation is dangerous when you spent years constructing a personality designed to avoid reality. There are people watching this right now who have not sat alone with their thoughts in months without immediately escaping into stimulation. Not because they are busy. Because stillness reveals what distraction hides. Unfinished potential, ignored responsibilities, avoided fears, buried resentment, wasted time. And time is the one thing weak people gamble with as if they own an infinite supply of it. They say, "I'll start next week. I just need motivation. I'm waiting for the right moment." No, they are waiting to emotionally feel ready for discomfort. That moment never arrives. The disciplined understand something the weak never fully accept. Action must come before emotional certainty. Not after. A soldier does not wait to feel brave before moving. A fighter does not wait to feel relaxed before entering conflict. A disciplined mind does not negotiate with temporary emotion. It moves despite emotion. That distinction changes everything. Because weak people worship feelings. Strong people observe feelings. There is a difference. A weak mind says, "I don't feel motivated today." A disciplined mind says, "That is irrelevant." And at first, this sounds cold, almost robotic, but it is actually freedom. Because emotional dependence creates unstable lives. If your actions depend on mood, your future becomes unpredictable. If your discipline depends on inspiration, your progress collapses the moment life becomes difficult. If your standards disappear under pressure, then they were never standards. They were preferences. This is why modern people keep rebuilding their lives from zero every few months. They confuse emotional intensity with transformation. One powerful video. One emotional night, one burst of motivation, one promise to become different. Then nothing changes, because intensity is not discipline. Repetition is, and repetition is brutally unglamorous. That is what nobody tells you. Real transformation is boring to watch. It looks repetitive, quiet, uncelebrated, invisible. The gym when nobody notices. The early mornings nobody applauds. The refusal to indulge every impulse. The decision to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Discipline is deeply lonely in the beginning. Because your environment often benefits from your weakness. People say they want you to improve until your improvement forces them to confront themselves. Then resistance begins. Subtle comments, jokes, dismissal, distance. You stop wasting money recklessly, suddenly you are too serious. You stop tolerating disrespect, suddenly you changed. You become focused, suddenly people accuse you of thinking you were better than them. No, you simply stopped abandoning yourself to maintain comfort for others. And weak people feel threatened when someone nearby develops self-respect. Because self-respect changes behavior. A disciplined person becomes harder to manipulate, harder to distract, harder to emotionally control. That threatens systems built on your impulsiveness. This is why almost everything around you profits from weakness. Your distraction is profitable. Your insecurity is profitable. Your lack of focus is profitable. Your addiction to stimulation is profitable. A calm, disciplined, self-controlled person becomes difficult to exploit. So the modern world constantly trains you toward fragmentation. Faster entertainment, shorter attention spans, more outrage, more noise, more comparison, more dependency, and slowly, without noticing, people lose the ability to command themselves. Not physically, mentally. That is the real collapse happening. And maybe you already feel it. Maybe you noticed your attention becoming weaker over the years. Maybe you noticed how hard it became to focus deeply. Maybe you noticed how easily your mind seeks escape the second discomfort appears. That is not accidental. Weak minds are easier to guide. A person unable to sit alone quietly for 30 minutes becomes controllable in ways they do not even recognize. Because if someone controls your attention long enough, eventually they influence your desires. Then your habits. Then your identity. Then your life. This is why discipline is no longer just self-improvement. It is self-defense. And the terrifying part, most people realize this too late. Usually after years disappear. Usually after regret becomes heavier than effort ever was. You see it in older men sometimes. Not all of them, but enough. There is a specific look in the eyes of a man who knows he betrayed his own potential repeatedly for comfort. It is difficult to describe unless you have seen it closely. The smile still exists. The routine still exists. Life continues. But underneath it sits something permanent. A quiet grief. Not because life attacked him. Because he slowly abandoned himself. One compromise at a time. And what destroys people psychologically is not suffering itself. It is knowing they participated in their own decline. That realization follows people into silence, into late nights, into empty mornings, into moments where distraction finally stops working. This is why some people stay permanently overstimulated. Because stillness becomes evidence, evidence of who they could have become. If this is uncomfortable to hear, good. Comfort has already cost you enough. Like this video if part of you is beginning to recognize the war happening inside your own mind. Comment the phrase, "Kill the weak self," if you are done negotiating with habits that quietly destroy your future. And subscribe if you are building a sovereign mindset rooted in discipline, emotional control, and psychological clarity instead of modern distraction. Because what comes next is where most people fail completely. Not at the beginning. At the moment discipline stops feeling exciting. That is where the real separation begins. And almost nobody is prepared for what they discover about themselves there. The most dangerous moment in self-improvement is not when you are weak. It is when you briefly become strong, and mistake momentum for permanence. That is where people get trapped. A few disciplined mornings, a temporary burst of focus, one productive week, a sudden obsession with change. And immediately the mind whispers something fatal. Maybe I've already changed. No, you experienced intensity. Transformation is what remains after intensity dies. That is the part social media rarely shows you. Nobody films the fifth lonely morning when motivation disappears. Nobody celebrates the nights where discipline feels mechanical and empty. Nobody romanticizes repetition when results arrive slowly. But those moments decide your future more than inspiration ever will. Because eventually every human being meets the same psychological wall. The moment effort stops feeling emotionally rewarding. That is where weak identities return to reclaim control. And they return intelligently, not dramatically. Your weak self does not scream. It negotiates. Skip today. You deserve rest. Tomorrow will be better. One distraction won't matter. You've already done enough. Listen carefully to the language of weakness. It almost always sounds reasonable. That is why people fail silently. Not because they lack ambition. Because they trust internal negotiations that were designed by the same mind trying to protect comfort. Comfort is seductive because it rarely feels dangerous immediately. That is how it survives. Nobody ruins their life in one night. They ruin it in invisible percentages. A little less discipline. A little more delay. A little more emotional indulgence. A little more escape. Then years pass. And suddenly they wake up inside consequences that once looked harmless. That is why disciplined people become unusually protective of small behaviors. They understand something weak people ignore. Tiny actions are never tiny when repeated daily. A man who cannot control 10 minutes of his attention should not trust himself with 10 years of his future. But modern people constantly underestimate repetition. They underestimate what daily distraction becomes after 5 years. They underestimate what avoidance becomes after 10. They underestimate what self-betrayal does to confidence over time. Confidence is not built from affirmations. It is built from evidence. The mind watches everything you do. Every promise kept. Every promise broken. Every excuse accepted. Every standard abandoned. And eventually your subconscious creates a conclusion about you. Reliable, or unreliable. Disciplined, or impulsive. Focused, or weak. People wonder why they no longer believe in themselves. Because internally, they have collected years of evidence proving they cannot trust their own word. That destroys self-respect faster than failure ever could. Failure can teach. Self-betrayal corrodes. There is a difference. And once self-respect starts collapsing, strange things begin happening psychologically. You avoid difficult opportunities. You hesitate before commitment. You procrastinate constantly. You seek validation more desperately. You become emotionally reactive to criticism. Why? Because weak discipline creates fragile identity. A person who cannot command themselves becomes hypersensitive to external opinion. Think about it. Why do insecure people constantly seek approval? Because internally they do not trust their own standards. So they borrow standards from others. Likes, attention, validation, social approval, external praise. Their emotional state becomes outsourced to strangers. That is why emotionally weak people are easily manipulated. If praise controls you, criticism will destroy you. Stoicism understood this centuries ago. Most suffering is not caused by events themselves. It is caused by dependence. Dependence on outcomes. Dependence on comfort. Dependence on recognition. Dependence on emotional certainty. The disciplined slowly detach from these things. Not because they become emotionless. Because they understand emotions are unstable leaders. And modern society trains emotional impulsiveness constantly. You see it everywhere now. People react instantly to everything. Instant outrage. Instant pleasure. Instant opinion. Instant stimulation. Nobody pauses. Nobody observes themselves. Nobody questions their own impulses anymore. And when a person loses the ability to pause before reacting, they become predictable. Predictable people are controllable people. This is why discipline begins with attention. Not motivation. Attention. Where your mind goes repeatedly becomes your life eventually. Most people treat attention carelessly because they do not understand its real value. Attention is not just focus. Attention is psychological currency. Whatever repeatedly captures your attention slowly shapes your nervous system. Your fears, your desires, your habits, your emotional reactions, your identity. That means every hour spent consuming chaos conditions the mind toward chaos. And people wonder why they feel restless. Look honestly at the average person's day now. Wake up, phone, notifications, noise, comparison, short videos, mental fragmentation, more stimulation, more escape, more dopamine, more exhaustion. Then they ask, why can't I focus? Why do I feel empty? Why does discipline feel impossible? Because their mind has been trained to avoid depth. Weakness is conditioning, and conditioning can become so normal that people mistake dysfunction for personality. I just have a short attention span. I'm naturally lazy. I work better under pressure. No, you adapted to undisciplined patterns repeated long enough to feel permanent. That should disturb you, because if behaviors can become identity through repetition, then identity can also be rebuilt through repetition. But rebuilding yourself requires something brutal. You must stop romanticizing the person you currently are. Many people secretly protect the very identity destroying them. They cling to labels, excuses, traumas, past versions of themselves. Even their suffering becomes part of their personality. You can see this when someone receives practical advice but immediately explains why change is impossible for them specifically. That reaction reveals attachment. People defend familiar suffering because it gives them certainty. Transformation threatens certainty, because if change is possible, then responsibility returns. And responsibility terrifies weak minds. Not because responsibility is cruel. Because responsibility removes excuses. Once you realize your habits are shaping your future daily, avoidance becomes harder to justify. You can no longer pretend ignorance. That is why many people avoid deep self-awareness. Awareness creates obligation, and obligation creates pressure. So instead, they distract themselves endlessly while calling it relaxation. But there is a difference between recovery and escape. Recovery restores you. Escape weakens you while pretending to soothe you. The modern world sells escape disguised as pleasure constantly. Endless entertainment, endless consumption, endless distraction. But after enough escape, something frightening happens. You stop respecting your own mind. You become mentally soft. Small inconveniences irritate you. Simple tasks feel overwhelming. Silence becomes unbearable. Focus feels painful. Discomfort feels threatening. That is not normal human nature. That is conditioned fragility. And fragile people suffer intensely because reality does not negotiate with emotional weakness. Life remains difficult regardless of feelings. Bills still arrive. Time still passes. Consequences still accumulate. Opportunities still disappear. The disciplined accept this early. Weak people spend years emotionally resisting reality instead of adapting to it. That resistance creates unnecessary suffering. Marcus Aurelius understood something modern people avoid completely. Your mind becomes stronger when it stops expecting life to obey your preferences. Read that again carefully. A weak person says, "This shouldn't be happening." A disciplined person says, "It is happening. Now what?" That single shift changes everything psychologically. Because acceptance creates movement, resistance creates paralysis. And no, acceptance does not mean passivity. It means clarity. You stop wasting energy emotionally arguing with facts that already exist. Most people lose enormous amounts of mental energy fighting reality internally. They replay conversations, complain constantly, resent discomfort, fear uncertainty, obsess over unfairness. Meanwhile, disciplined individuals redirect that same energy toward adaptation. That is why they progress faster. Not because life is easier for them. Because they recover from emotional friction faster. And emotional recovery is one of the most underrated forms of power in existence. Can you regain composure quickly? Can you function despite disappointment? Can you move despite uncertainty? Can you maintain standards under pressure? Most people cannot. One emotional setback destroys their consistency for weeks. A breakup, a criticism, a failure, a stressful month. Suddenly discipline disappears completely. That reveals a painful truth. Their discipline was emotional dependency disguised as ambition. Real discipline survives mood shifts. That is why Stoic philosophy feels cold to emotionally impulsive people. Because it demands internal responsibility. Not excuses. Not emotional theatrics. Not victim identity. Responsibility. And responsibility feels heavy at first because weak identities avoid carrying weight. But eventually something unexpected happens. Responsibility becomes empowering. Because when you stop blaming everything externally, you regain influence over your own life. That is where personal power begins. Not in domination over others. In command over yourself. And self-command changes the way you move through the world. Your reactions slow down. Your emotions stabilize. Your standards sharpen. Your attention strengthens. People notice it too. Not through what you say. Through what no longer controls you. That is real presence. A disciplined person enters rooms differently because their nervous system is no longer begging for approval constantly. Weak people chase attention. Strong people control attention by controlling themselves. That distinction quietly changes social dynamics everywhere. You have already felt this before. Certain people walk into a room and instantly feel grounded, calm, clear, controlled, not because they are loud, because they are internally organized. Meanwhile, others enter every space emotionally leaking insecurity, talking excessively, seeking validation, performing constantly, needing reassurance. The difference is rarely talent. Usually it is nervous system discipline. And nervous system discipline is built through repeated exposure to discomfort without collapse. That is why hard things matter. Not because suffering itself is noble. Because controlled difficulty builds psychological stability. The gym matters because it teaches consistency under resistance. Silence matters because it exposes internal chaos. Focus matters because it rebuilds fragmented attention. Discipline matters because it restores self-trust. Every difficult act completed voluntarily strengthens identity. Every avoided discomfort weakens it. That is the hidden transaction happening every day. And the terrifying part, most people never realize they are training weakness daily until it becomes their permanent personality. By then, excuses feel natural. Distraction feels normal. Impulsiveness feels unavoidable. But none of it was inevitable. It was practiced. Which means strength can also be practiced. Slowly, quietly, repeatedly. And what comes next is where the transformation becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because eventually discipline forces you to confront something even harder than laziness. The people around you. Most people will support your growth publicly. Until your discipline begins exposing their lack of it privately. That is when the atmosphere changes. Not immediately, subtly. You begin waking up earlier. Your focus sharpens. Your standards rise. You stop laughing at things that once distracted you. You stop participating in self-destructive habits everyone normalized together. And suddenly people around you start acting differently. Not because you attacked them. Because your transformation became comparison without saying a word. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable around evidence that excuses are optional. That discomfort creates strange behavior. Some people will mock your routines. Some will minimize your goals. Some will accuse you of changing. Others will quietly distance themselves because your discipline forces them to confront their own stagnation. This is one of the loneliest parts of rebuilding yourself. Realizing not everyone benefits from your evolution. Especially people who bonded with the weaker version of you. That version was easier to predict, easier to influence, easier to keep emotionally available. But disciplined people become selective with energy. And weak environments hate boundaries. Pay attention to how people react the moment you stop tolerating behaviors that drain you. The same individuals who called you important suddenly call you different. The same people who wanted your attention become irritated when your priorities change. The same people who encouraged balance disappear when consequences arrive. Because many relationships are built on mutual weakness rather than mutual growth. That truth hurts, especially when it involves people you genuinely cared about. But Stoicism forces confrontation with reality, not fantasy. And reality is this: some people only love the version of you that requires less from them. The distracted version, the agreeable version, the emotionally dependent version, the self-neglecting version. But once you begin rebuilding discipline, your entire social experience changes. You notice how much conversation revolves around complaint instead of solutions. You notice how people bond through negativity. You notice how many individuals constantly seek escape because they cannot tolerate themselves internally. And eventually something disturbing becomes impossible to ignore. Most people are not moving intentionally. They are reacting endlessly, reacting to emotion, reacting to trends, reacting to social pressure, reacting to fear, reacting to loneliness, reacting to boredom. Very few people choose their lives consciously. They drift. And drifting feels safe because responsibility disappears inside the crowd. That is why average behavior spreads so easily. Weakness is socially contagious. So is discipline. But discipline spreads slower because it requires sacrifice. Weakness spreads rapidly because it requires nothing. Look around carefully. One distracted person can destroy the focus of an entire room. One emotionally unstable person can poison an entire environment. One impulsive person can drag others into years of unnecessary chaos. People underestimate environmental influence constantly. They think discipline is purely internal. It is not. Your environment trains your standards daily. The conversations around you matter. The people around you matter. The behaviors normalized around you matter. If everyone around you escapes discomfort constantly, eventually discomfort begins feeling abnormal to you too. That is dangerous. Because meaningful growth always requires temporary discomfort. Always. Not sometimes. Always. And weak environments slowly convince people that discomfort itself is unhealthy. This is one of the greatest psychological manipulations of modern culture. People now treat every uncomfortable emotion as something needing immediate elimination. Stress, boredom, loneliness, silence, difficulty. Everything must be numbed instantly. But human beings grow through properly endured tension. Not endless avoidance. A muscle grows through resistance. The mind grows through challenge. Character grows through responsibility. Remove all friction and humans become psychologically fragile. You can already see this happening. People collapse emotionally under criticism now. Minor inconvenience ruins entire days. Disagreement becomes personal attack. Temporary discomfort becomes identity crisis. Why? Because emotional resilience was never developed. And resilience cannot be built in permanent comfort. That is impossible. A mind constantly protected from pressure becomes weaker under pressure. This is why disciplined individuals voluntarily seek controlled difficulty. Cold mornings, hard training, focused work, silence, solitude, restraint. Not because suffering is attractive. Because comfort addiction is dangerous. And addiction to comfort is now everywhere. People want confidence without discomfort. Strength without struggle. Respect without standards. Results without repetition. That fantasy destroys people slowly. Because reality never adapts to emotional preference for long. Eventually consequences arrive. And consequences are brutally unemotional. The body reflects neglect. The mind reflects habits. The future reflects consistency. Always. That consistency is what terrifies most people once they fully understand it. Because deep down, they know they are not accidentally becoming who they are. They are rehearsing it daily. Every repeated action becomes rehearsal for identity. Every excuse rehearses weakness. Every act of discipline rehearses strength. Every moment of restraint rehearses control. Your future personality is being practiced right now. That should make you more careful about what you repeat. Because repetition becomes automatic eventually. And automatic behavior becomes destiny for most people. That is why disciplined individuals obsess over routines others consider insignificant. Sleep schedules, morning structure, attention control, physical training, environment. Weak people mock these things because they misunderstand them completely. Discipline is not about the task itself. It is about what the task teaches the nervous system. A man who trains himself to wake up consistently despite resistance is not just building routine. He is teaching himself that discomfort does not control action. That lesson transfers everywhere, into business, into relationships, into conflict, into emotional control. This is why physically disciplined people often become mentally stronger too. Not automatically, but repeated voluntary discomfort changes self-perception. You begin seeing yourself differently. More capable, more stable, less reactive, because self-image is built through evidence, not fantasy. Your mind believes what you repeatedly demonstrate. And this creates one of the greatest hidden advantages of discipline. Reduced internal chaos. Weak people live in constant negotiation with themselves. I should start. I need to change. I'll do it later. I know what I need to do. That internal conflict drains enormous energy. Disciplined people remove much of this friction through decision. Not emotion. Decision. They stop debating basic standards daily. Training happens. Work gets done. Boundaries remain. Focus is protected. This creates mental clarity weak people rarely experience. And clarity is powerful, because once mental noise decreases, reality becomes easier to see. You start recognizing manipulative behavior faster. You notice emotional dependency quicker. You detect weakness in yourself sooner. You stop romanticizing people who repeatedly damage your peace. Discipline sharpens perception. That is why rebuilding yourself often changes relationships dramatically. Not because you become arrogant. Because your tolerance for chaos decreases. You stop confusing intensity for connection. You stop chasing people emotionally unavailable. You stop entertaining endless disrespect disguised as personality. Weak people tolerate exhausting dynamics because loneliness terrifies them. Disciplined people eventually learn something different. Peace is more valuable than attention. That realization changes everything socially, especially for people addicted to validation. You can observe this clearly in relationships. Many people do not choose partners consciously. They choose emotional familiarity, even if familiarity is unhealthy. A neglected person may chase unavailable people. An insecure person may chase validation endlessly. A chaotic person may confuse instability with passion. Why? Because unresolved patterns seek repetition. And without self-awareness, people recreate their emotional wounds unconsciously for years. This is why discipline must eventually become psychological, not just physical. Anyone can temporarily improve habits. Far fewer confront the deeper patterns driving self-destruction. Patterns like needing approval, fearing solitude, escaping responsibility, avoiding silence, seeking distraction, mistaking attention for love. These hidden weaknesses quietly shape entire lives. And if you never confront them honestly, success itself will not save you. You can become financially successful and still emotionally weak. Physically impressive and still internally unstable. Socially admired and still dependent on validation. Stoicism aimed deeper than appearances. It aimed at inner sovereignty. The ability to remain internally stable regardless of external conditions. That is real power. Not dominance over others. Dominance over impulse. Because impulse ruins more lives than lack of intelligence ever will. Impulsive anger. Impulsive pleasure. Impulsive spending. Impulsive attachment. Impulsive distraction. An undisciplined impulse repeated long enough becomes self-destruction disguised as personality. And modern culture rewards impulsiveness constantly. Say everything immediately. React instantly. Consume endlessly. Indulge constantly. Patience disappeared. Restraint became weakness. Silence became awkward. But disciplined individuals understand something rare now. Not every impulse deserves expression. That lesson alone can save years of suffering. One restrained reaction can prevent permanent damage. One controlled emotion can preserve relationships. One disciplined decision can redirect an entire future. But weak people chase temporary emotional relief constantly. They say what they feel immediately. Spend based on impulse. Attach recklessly. Escape discomfort compulsively. Then later they wonder why life feels unstable. Because unstable behavior creates unstable identity. Always. And eventually, if you stay disciplined long enough, something strange begins happening internally. The need to impress people starts dying. Quietly. You stop explaining your goals to everyone. You stop seeking recognition constantly. You stop performing strength publicly. Because real discipline becomes private. It becomes part of your nervous system. And that is where transformation becomes dangerous in the best possible way. Because once discipline becomes identity instead of effort, the weak version of you starts losing control permanently. But before that happens completely, there is one final battle almost everyone faces. The battle against the voice that still remembers who you used to be. There is a version of you still living inside your mind that does not want you to change. Not because it hates you. Because it was built to protect you from uncertainty. That voice remembers every failure. Every embarrassment. Every abandoned goal. Every moment you tried to improve and eventually returned to old habits. So when you begin rebuilding yourself seriously, it reacts. Not loudly. Quietly. With doubt. What if you fail again? What if this version of you isn't real? What if discipline is temporary? What if you are forcing something unnatural? Most people think self-destruction comes from self-hatred. Sometimes it does. But more often, self-destruction comes from identity attachment. You become emotionally loyal to old versions of yourself. Even damaged versions. Because familiarity feels safer than reinvention. That is why people repeatedly return to habits they know are hurting them. Not because the habits are pleasurable anymore. Because the habits are familiar. The brain values predictability more than potential. This is why transformation feels psychologically violent at first. You are not merely changing behavior. You are interrupting emotional patterns your nervous system spent years rehearsing. And the deeper the pattern, the stronger the resistance. You can see this clearly when someone attempts serious discipline for the first time. At the beginning, they focus on visible behaviors, waking early, training, working harder, removing distractions. But eventually the real battle appears. The emotional withdrawal from the old self. That is the part nobody prepares for. Because once distraction decreases, buried emotions begin surfacing. Regret, anger, shame, fear, loneliness. Many people mistake this stage as failure. It is not. It is exposure. For years, stimulation kept those emotions buried beneath noise. Now silence is uncovering them. And weak people usually run at this point. Back to entertainment. Back to distraction. Back to old relationships. Back to impulsive habits. Not because those things solve anything. Because familiarity temporarily numbs confrontation. This is why some people remain permanently busy. Stillness threatens the identity they are trying to avoid meeting. A disciplined mind eventually realizes something uncomfortable. Your distractions were never random. They were emotional management systems. Some people use entertainment to avoid anxiety. Some use relationships to avoid loneliness. Some use pleasure to avoid emptiness. Some use ambition itself to avoid confronting internal wounds. Humans are experts at disguising avoidance as lifestyle. That is why honest self-observation becomes rare. True self-observation destroys illusion. And illusion is emotionally addictive. People cling to fantasies about themselves constantly. I work well under pressure. I just need the right opportunity. I could succeed if I really tried. I'm different from everyone else. Maybe. But potential without disciplined execution becomes psychological torture over time. Because deep down, the mind knows the difference between capability and action. That gap creates suffering, especially in intelligent people. Intelligent undisciplined people often suffer intensely because they can clearly imagine the life they could build, while simultaneously watching themselves fail to build it. That contradiction creates silent frustration. You begin resenting yourself privately. Avoiding mirrors emotionally. Escaping into fantasy instead of movement. Eventually even rest stops feeling peaceful because unfinished potential follows you everywhere. This is why weak discipline destroys inner peace. Not because productivity is everything. Because unresolved self-betrayal creates constant psychological tension. The mind does not forget repeated abandonment. Every ignored responsibility leaves residue. Every delayed action creates mental weight. Every broken promise weakens internal trust. People think discipline restricts freedom. In reality, lack of discipline destroys freedom first. A man addicted to impulse is not free. A mind controlled by distraction is not free. A person emotionally dependent on validation is not free. Freedom without self-control becomes self-destruction. Stoicism understood this long before modern psychology existed. The greatest prison was never external. It was internal slavery to impulse. And once you begin seeing this clearly, you start noticing how many people are unconsciously controlled by emotional triggers. One criticism ruins their confidence. One rejection destroys their stability. One uncomfortable emotion sends them searching for escape. Their inner world has no structure, no discipline, no emotional regulation, no psychological grounding, so life controls them completely. And when life controls you emotionally, fear multiplies everywhere. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of missing out, fear of being alone. Fear becomes the operating system. That is why weak people constantly seek distraction. Distraction interrupts fear temporarily, but disciplined people eventually discover something stronger than avoidance: exposure. They stop running from discomfort and start training themselves to remain stable inside it. That changes the nervous system fundamentally. You become less reactive, less impulsive, less emotionally fragile, not because you stop feeling emotion, because you stop obeying every emotion automatically. This distinction is everything. Emotional maturity is not emotional suppression. It is emotional governance. Can you feel anger without becoming destructive? Can you feel fear without paralysis? Can you feel loneliness without self-abandonment? Can you feel desire without losing control? Most people cannot, which is why external circumstances dominate their internal state constantly. A disciplined mind becomes harder to destabilize because it develops separation between feeling and action. That separation creates power, real power, not loud confidence, not performance, not aggression, calm control. And calm control terrifies chaotic people because they cannot manipulate reactions they cannot predict. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often appear intimidating without trying. Not because they are aggressive, because they are internally difficult to move. Modern culture misunderstands strength completely. People think strength is loudness, dominance, attention, visibility. But true strength is often quiet. The ability to remain composed during pressure. The ability to think clearly during emotion. The ability to delay gratification despite desire. The ability to continue despite uncertainty. That kind of strength changes lives. And strangely enough, it also changes the way time feels. Weak people experience time differently because their attention is fragmented constantly. Days disappear quickly when consciousness is consumed by distraction. That is why many people suddenly wake up shocked by their own age. Not because time accelerated, because presence disappeared. They were never fully inside their own lives. Always distracted, always escaping, always consuming. Years vanished inside mental fragmentation. Disciplined people experience time more intentionally because attention becomes sharper. Moments become clearer. Decisions become conscious. Life stops feeling entirely accidental. And once this awareness deepens, something irreversible happens. You stop wanting to waste yourself. Not from fear, from clarity. You finally understand how expensive weakness truly is. Weakness costs years. Weakness costs peace. Weakness costs self-respect. Weakness costs potential. Weakness costs relationships. Weakness costs direction. And eventually you realize the price was never worth the comfort. That realization changes your standards permanently. You stop admiring people solely for charisma or appearance. You start respecting consistency, integrity, emotional control, discipline under pressure, because those traits reveal internal structure. And internal structure determines long-term destiny more than temporary talent ever will. Talent without discipline eventually collapses into frustration. Discipline without talent still creates transformation. That is why disciplined people often surpass naturally gifted individuals over time. Because consistency compounds while impulse destroys momentum repeatedly. Compounding is one of the most important psychological laws nobody discusses enough. Tiny disciplined actions repeated long enough create massive identity shifts. Not immediately, gradually. A stronger body, a calmer mind, a sharper focus, a more stable emotional state, a more disciplined life. At first the changes feel invisible. Then one day something happens. You notice situations that once controlled you no longer affect you the same way. The urge to procrastinate weakens. The need for validation decreases. The attraction to chaos fades. Distraction loses its grip. And quietly, almost without realizing it, you become someone your former self would not recognize. That is real transformation, not dramatic declarations. Identity reconstruction through repeated disciplined action. But before that transformation becomes permanent, one final truth must be understood. Because discipline alone is not enough if you do not understand what all of this is ultimately protecting you from. And what it protects you from is far darker than laziness. It protects you from becoming emotionally owned by the modern world. The modern world does not need chains to control people anymore. It only needs distraction. A distracted mind becomes easier to influence than a restrained one ever could. That is why nearly everything competing for your attention today is engineered around impulse instead of clarity. Consume quickly, react instantly, feel constantly, think later, and after enough repetition, people stop belonging to themselves psychologically. Their emotions become programmable, their desires become manipulated, their attention becomes fragmented, their identity becomes externally shaped. Most never notice it happening. Because the process feels normal. Everyone else is distracted too. Everyone else is exhausted too. Everyone else is overstimulated too. Everyone else is emotionally reactive too. Weakness feels invisible when it becomes collective. But collective weakness still destroys individual lives. Quietly, you can already see the consequences everywhere. People cannot focus deeply anymore. Cannot sit still. Cannot delay gratification. Cannot tolerate boredom. Cannot regulate emotion without external stimulation. And when a person loses the ability to regulate themselves internally, they begin searching for external control systems everywhere. Validation, entertainment, substances, attention, relationships, status, anything to temporarily escape internal instability. That is why self-mastery has become rare now. Not because humans became incapable of discipline. Because modern life rewards impulsiveness constantly. The disciplined person now moves against the current by default. And swimming against the current is exhausting at first. Especially when nobody around you understands why you are doing it. Friends may call you distant. Family may call you obsessed. Others may accuse you of taking life too seriously. But they do not understand what you have started seeing clearly. You are no longer trying to improve your life casually. You are trying to reclaim ownership over your mind. That changes the meaning of discipline completely. The gym is no longer just physical. Work is no longer just financial. Silence is no longer just quiet. Focus is no longer just productivity. Everything becomes psychological training. Every moment of restraint strengthens sovereignty. Every controlled impulse rebuilds authority over yourself. Every disciplined action weakens the version of you built through avoidance. And eventually you notice something powerful. The things that once controlled you begin losing influence. Attention-seeking loses its appeal. Endless scrolling starts feeling hollow. Chaotic relationships become exhausting instead of exciting. Temporary pleasure stops feeling worth the long-term cost. Not because someone forced you to change. Because awareness matured into standards. That is the real evolution. Weak people rely on emotion to guide behavior. Disciplined people rely on principles. Emotion changes daily. Principles remain stable under pressure. And pressure reveals everyone eventually. Not the version they perform publicly. The real version. The version revealed through habits, reactions, consistency, impulse control, attention, behavior during difficulty. Life exposes identity over time without mercy. Which is why Stoicism focused so heavily on internal construction. Not external image. Anyone can appear confident temporarily. Anyone can imitate discipline briefly. Anyone can perform strength socially. But sustained adversity exposes what is real. A disciplined person becomes more stable under pressure. A weak person becomes more reactive under pressure. That difference determines entire futures. Because difficult seasons are inevitable. Loss comes. Stress comes. Failure comes. Rejection comes. Uncertainty comes. The question is never whether hardship arrives. The question is what hardship reveals about you when it does. If discomfort instantly destroys your standards, then your standards were fragile. If pressure immediately controls your emotions, then your emotional foundation was unstable. If loneliness makes you abandon yourself, then you were emotionally dependent, not emotionally disciplined. These truths sound harsh, but harsh truth creates stronger people than comforting lies ever will. That is why most people avoid deep honesty. Honesty creates responsibility. Once you admit distraction is damaging you, continuing becomes conscious self-destruction. Once you admit weak habits are shaping your future, excuses lose power. Once you admit your attention is fragmented, reclaiming it becomes your responsibility. That responsibility feels heavy initially. Then eventually it becomes liberating. Because disciplined people stop feeling like victims of their own minds. That is one of the greatest forms of peace a human being can experience. Internal order. Not perfect emotion. Not endless happiness. Order. The ability to trust yourself. The ability to remain composed during uncertainty. The ability to move despite resistance. The ability to protect your attention from chaos. That kind of stability changes the way you experience life entirely. You stop panicking over every setback. You stop reacting emotionally to every opinion. You stop chasing external approval compulsively. And slowly, something rare begins happening. You become difficult to manipulate. That is dangerous in a world dependent on impulsive people. Because a person who can control attention can control direction. And a person who controls direction becomes harder to influence through fear, trends, outrage, temptation, or social pressure. That is sovereignty. Not isolation from society. Independence from unconscious control. Most people never reach this point because they spend their entire lives reacting instead of observing. Reacting emotionally. Reacting socially. Reacting impulsively. But observation changes behavior. The moment you begin observing your impulses instead of instantly obeying them, transformation begins. You notice how often boredom triggers distraction. You notice how loneliness triggers emotional dependency. You notice how discomfort triggers escape. And awareness creates choice. That is the beginning of freedom. Not external freedom. Internal freedom. The freedom to pause. The freedom to choose response instead of reaction. The freedom to act according to principle instead of impulse. Weak people misunderstand this completely. They think freedom means unlimited indulgence. But unlimited indulgence creates slavery to desire. Real freedom requires restraint. A man unable to control his urges is controlled by them. A mind unable to focus is controlled by distraction. A person unable to endure discomfort is controlled by comfort. Stoicism understood this long ago. The highest form of power was mastery over self. Not because self-control makes life perfect. Because self-control prevents chaos from owning your mind completely. And perhaps this is what you have been searching for all along without realizing it. Not motivation. Not temporary inspiration. Stability. A stable mind. A stable identity. A stable internal foundation unaffected by every external shift. That stability becomes priceless once you experience it. Because peace earned through discipline feels different from pleasure purchased through escape. One strengthens you. The other weakens you while pretending to soothe you. And eventually you reach a moment where the weak version of yourself no longer feels attractive. Not because you became superior to others. Because you finally experienced what self-respect feels like. Real self-respect. Not confidence performed publicly. Private alignment between values and actions. That alignment changes the way you walk through life. You stop needing constant reassurance. You stop fearing silence. You stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. You become calmer, sharper, more intentional, and strangely enough, you also become harder to break. Not invincible, human, but grounded. Because disciplined people are not fearless. They simply stop allowing fear to make decisions for them. That is the final separation. Weak people obey emotion. Disciplined people observe emotion and continue moving anyway. That is why discipline rebuilds identity at the deepest level. It proves to your own mind that discomfort no longer controls your direction. And once the mind believes that, everything changes. So if you reached this point, understand what this video was really about. Not productivity, not routines, not aesthetics, ownership. Ownership over attention, ownership over emotion, ownership over behavior, ownership over identity. Because the moment you stop governing yourself, something else eventually will. Like the video if part of you recognizes that the battle was never against the world first, but against the weak habits quietly controlling your mind. Comment. I reclaim my mind, if you are done living reactively. Share this with someone trapped in distraction before they lose more years to unconscious habits. And subscribe if you are building a sovereign mindset rooted in discipline, emotional control, clarity, and independence from the chaos shaping modern people. But do not let this become another moment of temporary intensity. That is the trap. Do not close this video and immediately return to unconscious behavior. Do not let recognition die inside comfort again. Sit with the discomfort. Observe your habits honestly. Protect your attention. Strengthen your mind through repetition. Rebuild self-trust one action at a time. Quietly. Because real transformation rarely announces itself loudly. It compounds in silence until one day your entire life reflects decisions nobody else noticed you making. And when this video ends, another choice begins. Return to distraction, or continue becoming someone your weaker self could never control again.